So today, Natalie, who's a medical anthropologist, she'll be giving us a talk on ancestral spirits, mental well-being, and diversity. And she's written books on spiritual psychiatry and cultural perspectives on well-being. And she's got a course coming up next week as well. Okay, so I think you'll need 30 minutes, the presentation, and that will lead on to questions and discussion afterwards.
Yes, I hope that'll be good. So would you like to keep your microphones off, and then when you ask a question, you can either put it in the chat box, which is the little square at the bottom of your screen, or you can catch Joe's attention. What I'd like to do to begin with is to share my screen and give a talk looking at diversity and why we might need to address it, and what's this got to do with ancestors and spirits. So that's my plan, but let me see if I can do that now. You may need to talk about yourself for a moment.
Well, I'll just introduce myself, as I didn't just now. I'm Zelda. I live in Amsterdam. I'm an hour ahead of the UK. So, good evening. Nice to see you, Joe. And you, Natalie.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Nice to see you. So, can you all see the screen? Is it shared with you?
No.
No. It's technology, isn't it?
Yeah. Now it's working.
Okay. Okay. So, what I wanted to explore today is the mono interpretations of health. That's Joe's word. I learnt it off Joe the other week about what is the problem of having one way of looking at mental health. And the Licorish Allsorts will become apparent later as to why I've got a picture of Licorish Allsorts at the top of the screen. So the plan is today to give a presentation of around 20 minutes, and then note what questions either in the chat box. If I say anything that you think is out of order, then do comment, and then we'll have final discussions. So the question of confidentiality, what stays here, and then if you keep your mobiles and your microphones off unless you're talking. And is it okay if we record the session? Yeah. Is everybody okay? That's good. So in my opinion, the problems that we have today when looking at health, and with mental health in particular, is that there's just one interpretation of people's so-called symptoms, and there's different hierarchies of knowledge, like whose knowledge counts and whose doesn't. And the dilemma that we've got is that the Western opinions have tended to dominate the cultural opinions across the world, and this is a problem for mental health. And there's this assumption that the biomedical models of mental health are universal, and they're not. And sometimes it feels patients feel obliged to take medication for a chemical imbalance of the brain. And what I wanted to do today is look at different cultural perspectives on mental health. And I put this map in because I like maps, as it happens. What it shows is that just in West London, these are the countries that people are from throughout the world. This is from the Office of National Statistics. And this is why I think we need to know more than one way of interpreting so-called symptoms. We've got North America, South America, Russia, Africa, Australia, India. So we need to be aware that there's different ways of understanding health. And then if we look at global mental health, which I do as an anthropologist, I find that there's two meanings, and one of them is this export of the medical model and the adherence to the diagnostic and statistical manuals in order to promote agreed symptoms and pharmaceutical treatments. And then the other model of global mental health, the same word, are looking at cultural models of health to promote different understandings about the meanings of symptoms. And here's the page on Liquorish Allsorts, which is the most important, of course. The explanations that people have for mental health are similar to Liquorish Allsorts, and we choose whichever one fits our current belief. And who am I to say, well, this one's right and the other one's wrong, unless I can speak or shout the loudest?
Can you take that in here?
Say that again. So, Liquorish Allsorts, it can mean different paradigms and different ways of looking at health. We can have the materialist way, which is suggesting there's diseases of the brain and chemical imbalance. We can have the religious way, suggesting there's contact with a god or deity. And then in order to treat it, you need prayer rituals. Or we can have just the psychological way, which is things that happen after birth and that are dealt with through open dialogue or talking therapies. Then there's the spiritual paradigm about opening to the divine and altered states of consciousness and having spiritual breakdown and awakening. And then there's the spiritist way, which is looking at ancestors, past lives, ghosts, supernatural beings, and different ways of looking at health. Now, in my opinion, there's a whole diversity of explanations of expanded consciousness. There's the spontaneous experiences that people have that can be religious experiences or mystical or out-of-body experiences. That people have those experiences, then they stop, end of conversation. Then there's the specialists like the shamans and the psychics and the remote seers who can deliberately switch on and switch off those kinds of experiences. And then thirdly and finally, there's the experiences people have been calling psychotic, which are people experiencing voices and visions, severe distress, but with no on-off switch. That's the difference between spontaneous experiences, start and end, specialists, stop and start. It's called psychotic when you have those experiences and you can't turn them off. And I wanted to look at othering, like we other people based on the colour of their skin, or the type of hair they come from, or the country they come from, or their beliefs. So we're really good at othering in the West, and it can mean that there's unconscious racism or unconscious assumptions about health or about other people's beliefs. You know, my beliefs are always correct and yours are always wrong. So we other people based on that. And there's beliefs about the nature of reality. Then I'll look at visionary experiences. And I've got pictures here of the Pope and Jesus Christ on the cross with light coming through. And there's a lovely stamp at the bottom from Belgium, which shows a Jewish rabbi, a Christian priest, and a Muslim imam. So those are the kinds of religious experiences that we seem comfortable with in the West. And the visionary experiences that we may be more uncomfortable with are those from Africa, South America, Asia, China. We've got Mama Wata, the Yoruba water spirit. We've got a Tairona priest from Colombia, or the moon goddess from China, or India, the mother goddess Kali. So if someone comes to a counsellor from other ways, other visions that don't fit the Abrahamic one, then counsellors may become uncomfortable. And then who's to say who's right and who's wrong? So I've got a couple of examples of religious experiences that we're comfortable with, like Moses and the burning bush, and Florence Nightingale, who heard the voice of God to set up hospitals, and she listened. I think we need another Florence Nightingale at the moment. There's also the religious experience that we accept at the town of Lourdes, where someone had a vision of Mary, and it's taken 200 million visitors and 7,000 miracles reported. But the Roman Catholic Church only recognises 70 healings in all that time as miraculous. And I just got one more visionary experience with Nikola Tesla. And he developed the modern system of electricity. And he experienced visions, and he had blinding flashes of light and visions before his eyes. And sometimes the visions that he had provided solutions to his engineering problems. So from him, I'm going to change tack a little bit, only slightly. I'm going to look at what's been called gender dysphoria in the West, and we'll look at the kind of multiple explanations that people have for it. And there's a marvelous film called Two Spirits about Krista Mutt, who, when I met her, she was a man, and she transitioned when she was 60 years old and went to Bangkok for surgery, and she's now a woman. And I've got a couple of slides looking at different explanations for gender dysphoria. The film that you can see is marvelous. It's of her journey to transition, and the different models that we have for gender dysphoria. There's the biological model about chromosomes in the womb and insecticides. There's the psychological model about unresolved childhood issues, separation issues. Originally, gender dysphoria was thought to be a psychiatric condition, worthy of being a mental illness, but it was reclassified in DSM-5. And then I'll look at spiritual theories of causation. One, it could be spirit possession. A person is possessed by a spirit of different gender. And these are prevalent in the Southeast and Asia and in Africa. And the final one is where the veils between the worlds are thin and people may have been a different gender in a different life. And my question is, what kind of counselling do we offer for gender dysphoria? Do we only offer it if it's a psychological case? That's my interest. Someone might want to question me on that. I'm happy to do that. So there's problems with Euro-centric kind of counselling. And there was an article in The Guardian a month or so back by Coco Khan, who she thought that therapy was failing people of colour. And the things that she was saying, that was there were inappropriate questions, people distrusted the healthcare system, there was unacknowledged racism, people who weren't white were more likely to be sectioned and medicated. So there were different kinds of counselling that people experienced. And then there was also a fear that if the therapist was of the same ethnic group, there was fear of gossip or shame, poor marriage prospects. So the ideal Western model of counselling is this lovely couple sitting in green chairs having a one-to-one conversation. And for many other people from different places, it's family therapy, like open dialogue, talking about with everybody bringing in. So there's different models of counselling that suit people of different ethnicities. And all this, we are all one. And what I found when I worked in different places, if people use Euro-centric strategies like printed leaflets, they can fail to impact certain minority ethnic communities who may or may not be able to read when they arrive in the UK. And there's also this key assumption that people who may look ethnically the same, may practice the same religion, wear the same clothing, have the same hairstyle, but have completely different personal narratives. We don't know who's born British, and who's a traveller. So we do need to ask questions about trauma. And there's all kinds of loss that comes with migration, about people missing their ancestral home. I'm going to take a sip of tea now. Losing the support of their family, the isolation in UK, the trauma of the journey and death of members. So people who look the same ethnically may have completely different histories. And so the question needs to be asked, where were you coming from? Now, I've got the next few slides looking at spiritism and trauma, and wondering what is the relevance of spiritism and soldiers to mental health. So I've shifted again. So I've got a couple of pictures. One is the memorial in Staffordshire dedicated to servicemen and women killed on duty since World War II. And the one below is in Washington, the memorial of soldiers killed in action since World War II, with 78,000 soldiers missing. So my question is, what happens to unknown soldiers? What do people just lie dead where they are and that's the end of the story? So in my opinion, based on my reading, and I'm happy to be challenged if anybody's got different narratives, the spirits of people who die suddenly, who do not know they are dead, may roam around and may attach to the living, causing mental distress. So it's called war collateral, but the distress that it can bring to anybody if one becomes attached to someone who doesn't know it's died. There's memorials in Africa under the sea to tribute to people who died in slavery. And my question is again, what happens to the spirits of the people who died? This is a sculpture near Grenada in the Caribbean. And my question is, can human beings like you and me pick up ancestral beings? Can we pick up spirits? And there is a syndrome which was described in the New Scientist in 2013 called Cotard's syndrome, where it's identified as a delusional psychosis where sufferers imagine they are decomposing, dead or non-existent. That's Cotard's system. Now, it happens that when I was in my 20s and 30s, which I no longer am, I'm a little bit older than that, just a bit, but in my 20s and 30s, I could pick up intelligences of people who'd died. And I did some research and I'm thinking, am I the only one that can pick up this, that and the other? And no, I looked into it. It's a different talk. There's a lot of people who can pick up others who were violently killed. I was looking into the Nazi Holocaust. So my proposition is that there's others of us who may have been labelled as mental health problems, who may be picking up ancestral spirits or spirits of people who haven't been buried or prayed over. This is my assumption. And there appears to be a dilemma in our world. And Kofi Annan said, I'll just read it because it's in white at the top, we may have different religions, different languages, different coloured skin, but we all belong to one human race. We all share the same basic values. And it's that last sentence of his that I question, that we all share the same basic values. And it seems that our beliefs about ancestors may differ. We can have Euro-centric or colonial beliefs that influence our understanding of the self. And people from elsewhere who were brought up within the Western world question the way that they're treated. And migrants, first, second and third generation migrants, may struggle to integrate their experiences within Western frameworks of understanding, let alone indigenous people in colonized lands. We'll go there for a different talk. So there was the beginnings of an awareness of racism, and National Geographic, which had the magazine which had been going for years, decades, it said in 2018, for decades our coverage was racist. To rise above our past, we must acknowledge it. And they had their own magazine on racism. And my question to everybody is, are there other examples of subtle racism? My interest in this, you'll be pleased to hear these are the last few slides. My interest in this is cultural U-turns. And it's when a government realizes that the laws it made were in error and it criminalized people wrongly and it changes its mind. So decades later, the governments change their mind, revoke the laws, pardon people. I actually wanted the book I wrote on cultural perspectives on mental well-being, called Cultural U-turns, and the publishers refused because they said nobody will understand what it means. But what it means is when governments change their minds. And we do need a cultural U-turn now on how mental distress is treated and understood across culturally. And I've just got a few examples of historical cultural U-turns where we've had forced adoption, forced schooling in Australia and Indigenous American people, Canadian people. We've had where unmarried parents, where the babies of unmarried parents were assumed to be mentally deficient. I have a girlfriend a little older than me who was herself kept in an institution until she was 18 years old. And then she got a couple of PhDs. Sex outside of marriage was mental deviancy. Homosexuality was criminality. So we have had cultural U-turns in our past. It's normal for governments to change their minds. So my issue is I've got a problem with the education system, with mainstream and social media and with politics. My concern is that new students are being trained in old ways of thinking. And for me, that's just not good enough. I've been teaching in Brighton and Sussex Medical School for some years for medical students to be aware of different ways of thinking. And I feel that we need to train staff into much wider ways of thinking. And I'd like to know from everybody, how do we start? So this is the last slide and it says the end, but actually it's not the end. It's the beginning of listening to everybody there. I do have the course that Joe mentioned that starts on the 7th of May next week, in case anybody is interested. So this is where I'm ending, and this is where I'm hoping everybody else is beginning. So would anybody like to make a comment or question anything I've made? And if you do, would you unmute yourself?
I'll say something. Just, I thought that it was very good. Thank you. I really appreciate all that you offered there. And I think that you'd asked questions about, your own experience of kind of picking up the intelligence of people who died. And I was just very curious about that. And I kind of paired with what you've just asked about new students kind of thinking about that they're being taught old ways of thinking. So I guess my thought is, yes, actually, we have a gnosis, and we have abilities, I think, from my personal experience, and probably each of us from our personal experiences have experiences and knowledge, and we can know by our experience. Just like you know from your experience. And, I think for a long time we've tried to have this paradigm now where actually, we publish in a journal to the nth degree, and knowledge starts to sound the same, and it has to fit a certain niche. And now I think that we're really beginning to see just how outdated and irrelevant that is, and critical thinking and experiencing I hope that at least these kinds of conversations is kind of, for me, I think what I hope to infiltrate kind of circles with, and encourage anybody's curiosity or their belief about just sharing their experiences. I'd like to know. I don't have an answer, but I'd like to share, and I'd like for us to think critically, but to believe our, experiential knowing, not just what we read or what we're taught. So it's just that comment, and I think that just encouraging critical thinking and experiential learning. And I'd love to hear more about your experience as well, if you wanted to share. Thank you.
My experience is it was a few years ago, and it happened that I knew who Natalie was, and I knew who this person was, and I knew what experiences I was having, and I knew Nazi Holocaust. I haven't been traumatized. I knew those experiences. So I was lucky. I could differentiate. I could witness, this is who this person is, and that's who that person is. I think the problem comes when there's a merging, and we can't separate out what belongs to us, this person now, and that person then. And then how do you do healing? And I can't say for 1 minute that I'm healed, but I can talk a lot. So I don't know if anybody else has had similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly, I think it's down to perception. Like, everyone's experienced their own unique experience, it's their journey, we're all walking our own unique terrain in this adventure, so we say, journey. And we try on these, it's almost like we put on these different masks, and we experience all these different realms, should we say. I know I certainly do. And I where's the best seat in the house for this? With all these multi-dimensional, multi-perceptual, all these different experiences of reality. How do I not lose myself in all of that, in that sea of chaos? When I say psychosis, I use the word sea of chaos, because that's what it is. It's like, whoa, I'm getting hit here in the storm. I'm in the sea, I'm flapping about. How do I find the shore? How do I find the eye of the storm? I always use that imagery to help me get back to safety in myself. And I always say to myself, well, where's the best place for your perception to view all this? So I always say, well, you just be the observer, the silent watcher of this multi-cinema screen of what you're experiencing. At least then, I don't get lost in this role play, should we say?
Yeah. Yes, and it's this discerning which is which, and in my case, intellectually, I knew which was which. There's no way my body knew. My body was something else. My body didn't know. Karen, I've just seen what you've put in the chat. Would you like to just say what you've written? Would you unmute yourself?
Hi. Yeah, I was just, my husband, Ron Coleman, when he used to run the Hearing Voices groups in Manchester, I think it was during the 50th anniversary of the Holocaust, he suddenly had a group of young Jewish, I think mainly students, but young people coming in very distressed with hearing the voices of their ancestors in the actual Holocaust in the gas chambers, with great distress. And he started a group up specifically for them. And within a few weeks, it resolved itself. But, you know, there was, it was, you know, it was just said it was just an incredible experience that, you know, these people all together you know, were having these experiences 50 years on. And I thought it just sort of emphasized what you were saying, really.
Yeah, and sometimes because we're human, we may project it onto the human next to us, and it isn't their story. Yeah. It's a story from a different time, but if we don't acknowledge the different times.
Yeah, I suppose for me, when I'm working with people where there's a mixture of trauma and spiritual emergence and all those things together, for me, sort of finding the narratives and working through both the person's narratives, the narratives of their spiritual emergence, but also the narratives of their family history, really make a difference to what you begin to understand about the person. So having those sort of three, you know, if the person knows some stories of their ancestors, if they've, you know, and they also are able to talk about their own narrative history of their trauma, and then there's what happened within their spiritual emergences, you can often see loads of links between.
Yeah, and I think when they come to the table, then they can be addressed.
Yeah, and I suppose you never start by saying the person's mad, because they're not. It's just a jumble of different narratives and, you know, things going on for the person, and as long as you sort of are very curious, you can help the person make sense of those narratives for themselves, because it's not our journey, it's up to them to make the links and understand it, but we can ask questions.
Yeah.
I also thought about the theory of morphic resonance, and how there may be, you know, and even Tesla was making a discovery at the same time somebody else was making the discovery, you know, so there's something that we're potentially picking up with, you know, and opening up to, and the more that I mean, I know from, you know, experiences of meditation, sometimes there's insight. So the more that we practice these things, the more that perhaps we'll be more open to what's already present. Just the thought about morphic resonance. It sounded like you could have been picking up something that was already there, even if it didn't attach to you, like it was you were aware that there's something else present here and had a full knowledge of it. You know, why shouldn't we be able to pick those things up?
And how many more of us, is anybody else here had that kind of experience?
Hi Natalie, it's good to finally meet you in person, sort of. You know, when you started talking about this, my heart started beating, because I understood something that's happened to me as a child. I understood it intellectually over the years. I picked up on, you know, the sadness of war and killing, but I've never understood. My heart's beating my heart beats fast when I hear something that's true. And so I remember as a child going to Gettysburg and, you know, the battlefields of the United States. And I remember picking up on that. And of course it's terrible, people dying, because on both sides, somebody's son, but I didn't understand till now how it was inside of me, this, and still I read something and I find, you know, I just have this inside, and I never understood the power of it. I kind of understood, because I think it's kind of inherited through your DNA, all the different, well, it is inherited, some of those sufferings, but also in these places, I was hit, and I never understood it till now that you brought that out. Thank you.
Yeah, because there's two possibilities. One, it's the ancestral line, which I don't think mine was. I think I picked up something else beyond my ancestral line, and therefore I assume other people can do the same.
Right. Well, that's why I'm saying, when I was in these battlefields as a little girl, I would feel it very strongly, but I now I understand more what what you're saying. I understand what happened to me from what you're saying.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And we're all normal. Hannah, would you like to say something? Will you unmute yourself?
Yeah, cool. Hey, thank you for this. This has been really awesome. I really appreciated it. I have this sort of probably it's a real sadness around how for I think of like some of the discussions around abuse of children and that sort of stuff, and lots of the narrative that I've heard around how for children who've been sexually abused, the deep wounding that happens for us around our sense of spirituality and our sense of self and our ability to trust our intuition and our judgment from within us. And I have this real sadness around this when I think about across my lifespan the different sort of the dismissing of things that has occurred for me because of this inability to or this sort of mistrust of my judgment. And I feel like there's a real healing that's required in this element that often is not able to be addressed within counselling or therapeutic spaces, and that brings a sadness for me. And I love that these discussions are starting to occur so that people can connect with that, because so much of my healing has and my faith in myself has sat around these things that I have just been taught by a system that was supposed to heal me, that they're actually further indications of my brokenness, and it makes me angry. So I'm so grateful for today's discussion. Thank you so much.
Yes, because there's the reality of postnatal psychological issues like you're describing that need to be addressed, as well as things that may come in from elsewhere. I don't know if anybody else would like to talk on mental health and the practical. Margaret, have you got anything to say about mental health and practical ways of addressing it?
If it's this Margaret.
Yeah, this Margaret there.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm working in mental health and have been for some years. And what I find often is that people are referred as being mentally ill. And actually, if you just look a little bit, it doesn't take an awful lot to see that, for example, a family working, a woman living at home with 4 children, they're all trying to do their homework on a mobile phone, and she's tearing her hair out and she's screaming into a window or shouting or whatever. She may also be, well, in fact, recently working with somebody who's short of money, about to have her power cut off, a whole load of other things. And somebody might put a label on her as she's psychotic, a mad woman, a lunatic, whatever the labels are. But actually, she just needs a bit of practical help. And when that happens, I see people get better, using the term loosely, very quickly if somebody listens beyond the label of mental illness.
Yeah, so mental illness has been labelled for things that don't fit whatever normal is, and I think normal currently is gone out the window.
I have a friend of mine who's doing a PhD in spirituality and mental health right now, and she actually just published a paper in psychiatric epidemiology journal, and did some surveying of patients, quote unquote clients, in different settings who had been asked about their experiences in mental health and spirituality, and said that they thought that mental health professionals did not ask enough, and that they wanted to be asked about it. They wanted to have a choice to talk about their experience, and that they wanted to be able to identify any kind of crisis in their spirituality. They didn't want to be stigmatized about it. They wanted to be able to have some chance to make meaning out of their experiences, and that it was actually quite fundamental to their identity. So this is very good. It's a paper that's just been published this year. Katja Milner, Milner, by Journal of, I think, Psychiatric Epidemiology,
Okay.
if you're interested.
Would you put it in the chat box and then Joe can share it with us? Is there
Sure.
anyone else who would like to share their experience of being normal? Or
I'd like to say something. I don't know if anyone else, but
Mary?
I mean, I've been through spiritual emergence. I've also witnessed my brother many years ago who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and now, because of my own experiences, I'd say he was going through a spiritual emergence. But I'm not going to go through all the things that can happen, because all sorts of things can happen. Collective unconscious, spirit attachment, ancestral stuff. I mean, you can get an array of different experiences going on in a spiritual emergency. You can't just say this one thing is going on. It can be so many different things. But what I'm more concerned with is practical solutions. I'm really concerned, like, people can write papers and we can carry on, but what practically are we going to do to challenge psychiatry? Okay, I know papers can, academic people writing, I think it's great. Some research that happens is great. To say, oh, people need green spaces, that makes them feel better. Oh, right, okay, so we have to have lots of research papers telling us that keeping people on locked ward is not a good idea. You know, sometimes it's just common sense, talking to people, open dialogue. We know the things that work, that, you know, a lot of the time it's basic things that work. You know, unless we can get shamans on the ward, just having occupational therapy, having people not be heavily medicated, coercive treatment. These are the basic things we need to start fighting for. And we need to start challenging very directly the people that have got the money and the power, the resources that are being misused. And, you know, I've seen 35 years of this and I don't see much changing. You know, there's some new initiatives like open dialogue and we can have these discussions. I mean, it's great, but we have to be active in campaigning. It has to happen. We have to talk to psychiatrists. There's no psychiatrists here. We have to actively be challenging them and about the conditions that people are kept in. You know, there'd be enough to traumatize anyone, even if you were reasonably well. If you put anyone in hospital for 3 weeks with nothing to do, you know. So I just wonder where this is, you know, where we're going to go with all of this on a practical level, because that's really what I'm concerned with.
Yeah, that's my question too, Naomi. What do we do? I've written the books, I've taught the courses. It hasn't created change, right?
Exactly.
In a lovely academic manner. Yeah. It looks all very nice, but it doesn't create change. And my interest is, how can we create change in the system so that we're heard, so that all the evidence that each of us have is heard and seen and changes the teaching, the actual teaching, or is that too grandiose that we should each do our little bit? And
no, I don't think that's too grandiose at all. I mean, first of all, I don't think psychiatrists themselves are just one homogenous mass. You know, some of them are more open. Some of them come from diverse backgrounds themselves and have their own ideas about this. They're not all westernized in their mentality. And people are already challenging it. People are, you know, maybe going into your health authority, going into creating alternative, like the Dragon Cafe, and people that have created, you know, their own little projects that show people with good health outcomes, saying, look, this is how you do it. This is what people want. Practically creating these projects. I mean, the Dragon Cafe, I don't know if you know the Dragon Cafe. Do you know it?
Yes, because Sarah spoke about it.
It's just a perfect example of something that works. There you've got it. 1 day a week in South London. You've got an example of this is what psychiatry could look like. This is what open dialogue, this is what treating people as human beings and not just pathologizing them. And I think we've got to start doing more of those practical things rather than having discussions. Discussions are great for sharing information, but we have to act.
Thank you. Can I ask, if got two hands up, one Margaret and one Karen, just asking for examples of practical things that have done. Karen, do you want to say first, then Margaret, then Alan?
I think I suppose it depends on your circumstances. For a few years we ran a recovery house here, which we funded through our, the money that we got from training, so people could come for free. Yes, it could only deal with a couple of people, but certainly we had people who went through some spiritual experiences. Most came who had psychosis. And so there are things like that you can do, but obviously you're only able to help a couple of people. But I suppose if more people did those kind of things, then you'd begin to start to grow a different movement. And we did have one recovery house in Italy research to show that it had a better outcome. But I think also it's how we do our own work. I mean, during this COVID plus, I've taken on about 3 or 4 new people that, because I've got no work, so just off to talking through them, and it's really interesting. Most of them are on a mixture of a spiritual journey, a trauma journey, and have a label of psychosis. And again, by unpicking these things, we can find it a new way forward. So I suppose we can do. And, that's something I've always, from the moment I started working in mental health, it was about what can I do? My hope is that by, for example, I'm working with one person, that maybe eventually we've got enough evidence and story to then go to the psychiatrist and say, hang on a minute here, there is another alternative way you can look at this. And I was part of a meeting that was on alternatives a couple of nights ago in London, and I've just given a link to a new book that's just come out called Breaking Open, which is 13 people's journeys through spiritual emergence, and I think most of them had been labelled psychotic. And one of the presenters at the meeting was Tim Reed, who is a psychiatrist in London, who's very interested in all this work. So there are people there. It's just a matter of linking in and so I think these discussions are important in that we begin to see, and quite often we're at the same meetings, so you begin to see there is a network.
Yeah,
then about not just discussing it, it's actually doing it, and you do it by just trying. I think it's not about, yes, okay, I've had 35 years of working in mental health, so of course there's a lot of stuff that I've learned, but there's also a lot of stuff I had to chuck away, that wasn't good learning. And actually most of the things that you end up doing with people is just experimenting, just being free of the adverse risk type ways we're told to work in services.
But it's like there's so many of us now doing that kind of thing, like Margaret in Dublin. Margaret in the States, did you want to make comment? Thank you, Karen, and then Alan.
Yes, I think that I've seen practical things happening. There's a forum, a Facebook forum called Speak Out Against Psychiatry. It's an open forum, but people talk among themselves. So it seems like it's not practical, because how are we going to get this out? But the more that people share, the more that we're unafraid to share. And there's the work of Katie Mottram in Emerging Proud, and she's published a lot of our stories. She fell apart, and now she has a publishing company. It's all about emerging proud. And I feel that the more that we share, even though it seems behind closed doors, there is a critical mass happening, like the previous speaker said, because it seems that it's closed and that we're only sharing stories or whatever. But the less stigma you have about it, and you can come out and say, I went through this, I had a brush with the psychiatric system, and we're here. And the system, to me, was very harmful. I don't know, it's something that has to be overthrown. But the more this network comes together, the more we realize we're not alone in it, and there's strength in it.
Yeah.
And also a psychiatrist I saw many years ago, after a period of normal grief, I had a loss. Someone recommended a psychiatrist and said it would change my life. Well, it certainly did. I was given a label because I was down, so I was giving uppers. So then I'm bipolar forever? No. I took it for a while, but now you can go in there and you can give those people reviews, and it's going to crumble. We're not alone in this, because
and I think people are right. There are plenty of psychiatrists now who are questioning the training that they have been given. Alan F., would you like to make a comment?
Yes, I like to back up what Margaret said. I mean, I found Emerging Proud really quite inspiring. No, literally. So I think there's two things I want to say is that on a more global level, Emerging Proud, I know that Katie's working with a friend of mine called Samir on doing, who's a filmmaker, and that they're working on a film, which I'm sure will be really brilliant. But they're working on a broader level to try to increase awareness, and then all of us are more, wherever we live. I think it's a matter of chipping away. So I mean, I live in Oxford, and the medical profession here are incredibly closed and traditional, but there are people who are trying to combat that. So I think we just keep on chipping away on our own different local levels, and also support what people like Katie are doing on a slightly broader level. I mean, it's so difficult because we're fighting against a cultural norm, because this society traditionally has called itself Christian or whatever, but actually it's a deeply unspiritual society, that anything that is not materialistic is seen as being not part of the norm. Now, we know that's not true. We know that the mass society is living under an illusion. It's a battle, but if we keep on chipping away, we can make a difference.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's also some years ago, Katie and I were invited to speak at an event at the Royal College of Psychiatry, and each of us was turned down because neither of us had the right credentials. It may be different now, but things may change. I am aware of the time. We have been talking for an hour. Is there anyone else who'd like to make a comment? Eugenia, would you like to make a comment before we ask Joe to summarize?
Yeah, greetings from Hong Kong. I'm actually an academic that kind of went through the process in the early 90s. And the thing that helped me through very rapidly was Qigong. So I'm Asian and Eastern practices. And a large part of it is, I see it as a regulation of qi, or energy, and the physiology. And with this, actually, just a short story. I've been in digital entertainment for about 30 years. The last 15 years, I do research in consciousness, in phenomenology and neurophysiology. In the UK, there's a guy named Peter Fennick, who's a leading authority on near-death, who's a close collaborator of mine.
Yeah, we know Peter.
And what happened with me is in 2012, I had my sister brought me to a Vedanta workshop. So I had this experience. I didn't know what it was, so I just got married, did my career life. And then in 2012, my sister brought me to this 3-day Vedanta workshop. And I was like, during the workshop, I was like, wait a minute. I know all of this stuff from this thing that happened to me 10 years ago. I was like, what? That was real? And then that kind of kicked a thing which then shifted me towards this area. There's a talk that I give around the world called Personal Development, Mental Health, and Human Potential. And so personal development is basically acclimatizing to the modern world. And so all of these things that you're talking about fighting are consensus reality. And then mental health is when you pop out of that and you have no reference and you have strong attachment to the things that you've been told and taught, and you're getting new information and new experiences that consensus reality can't quite sort out. And then human potential is, if you can get through that and stay grounded and ground yourself with this, then hearing the voices and all of this become clairvoyants, become intuitives, become, seers, become energy healers. All of these abilities that you develop in a grounded way then are human potential. And so I research with people with special abilities. Peter Fennick does as well too. We have a subject named Alan Forget that we both study. But then in Asia and in China, there's a whole community of these people. And related to this is a big challenge. Sean is here too. Sean Blackwell, I think he spoke here as well too. But he
spoke last week, yes.
Yeah, so he's gone through process and he's researched what the best he can from a Western perspective as well too, and looking at holotropic breath work and actually being in nature and these things. And so we have a project right now called Antarabhav. And the whole point behind this is that rather than trying to fight the system, just make a new one. And then now if you think about what's happening with money and blockchain and cryptocurrency, and a lot of people are kind of casting away the old ways and looking for new ways. And with Antarabhav, what we're doing is we have places around the world in nature, all around the world, we're setting up with people that have gone through the process. And the original idea was a Betty Ford clinic for people going through spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency.
Can I ask you, is it possible for you to type in the chat the links to the things that you're mentioning so that everybody can see it later and it can be used as a resource? We've also got Peter Fennick and David Lorimer who are working on the Galileo project that are looking at unusual experiences and normalizing them, and not everybody's on the same page.
I understand that there is that, and the guy that wrote the original paper for that is also a collaborator. It's his birthday today, Chris Thompson. I don't know if you know him, but he's in Spain right now, and so part of what it's this thing that I'm talking about here is actually part of a whole thing. One is we're working with entrepreneurs and artists, people that are kind of at the fringe, and then this thing here is a safety net for these people. And so we have this whole entrepreneurship as a spiritual path. So these are people that have rejected consensus reality and are trying to do something new, and they're the ones that are more susceptible. Antarabhav is the safety net. And then what the latest thing that Chris Thompson, who also founded the Galileo thing, and this is all European, but this is a global thing. India, China, we have like massive histories in all of this, and we haven't even talked about plant medicine and everything, and shamanism. But the idea above this, once you can get through this and you can be grounded, and we have protocols for this kind of thing, then the next, although it may take a while, the next thing above that is a global, what Chris is working on, from his perspective, is a modern mystery school. And for
my interest, can I stop you there? Can I stop
global
you there?
Decentralized mystery school? Sure.
Can I stop you there? Can I stop you there? The mystery school, my interest is in what can we do with the health professionals now? And if we have mystery schools and things that look esoteric, they're going to turn away from us. My thing is, I don't want to fight with the system. I want to work with the system to create change. And maybe that's crazy of me, but that's what I want to do. I am
my answer to that
time, and there is one more hand next to you. Would you like to make a comment before we ask Joe to tie up everything? Is it Ruth?
Was it? Is it mine? Is it mine?
Yes, go on.
Jenny.
I can't see. There's two hands.
Is it
up.
Jenny? Is it mine, Jenny?
Yes, Jenny.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating tonight. I've heard so much and heard so much. I just wanted to say that I've come in through. My things come through the Katie Mottram route, and I live in the northeast UK, which is really quite a harsh place for this kind of thing. And just to say that at the moment, I'm very in it with a loved one who's very in the thing and the system's not working, etc., etc. And I did try and speak about spirituality with a psychiatrist about 4 or 5 years ago, and he just never came back to us, even though he said, oh yes, I'd be interested to learn about spirituality, but he never did. He didn't come and watch the Crazy Wise film or anything. So it was just to let you know that I'm really interested. Everybody's doing everything from the outside, and just to let everybody know that I'm in it, like in it with a loved one, actually going through all these processes now. So thank you to everybody for all the input and everything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We report you. And Ruth, did you want to say something before we go to Joe? Can you unmute yourself? I can't hear. Ruth, I can't hear you. You're muted. Will you type it in? Okay. Ruth, do type it because we can't hear you, and then at least we've got a record of your question. Joe, I'm aware of the time. Would you like to summarise where we've been today and unmute yourself?
Okay. Well, firstly, I remember with your presentation, you're saying there's two interpretations of mental health and well-being. One seems to be about diagnosis and which symptoms, and the other one seems to be a cultural perspective. And then you explored different people's experiences from different cultures. And then people were sharing some of their own stories and questions and inquiries about this. And how it seems that there's something around what is deemed normal and what's outside of what is normal based on experience. So it sounds like what we're talking about is what we're told is right or normal, and what we experience is something different. And there's like a wider discussion how we can sort of have a bigger framework that can actually validate these experiences. And there's been ideas and theories around how we can broaden this. And then there's sort of like an undercurrent of activism, how we can actively get involved and do this together, and suggesting different campaigns or projects or groups that can help facilitate this. And it's been really brilliant hearing everyone get together and getting involved in different ways.
Thank you, Joe. It's been great to hear what's actually happening on the ground, and for those people who've got real experiences and real relationships where they have to deal with these things. So thank you all for participating. Would you like to unmute yourselves and then say what you need to say?